things, which will help us to move farther back away from the
Well,
social responsibility to personal responsibility.
I'm thinking that given strongly held social values that people who are seriously ill ought to be cared for, that we can move in the direction of individual responsibility while still having some spreading of risk.
But let me note that
Yeah.
that socially held position is very old.
Mhm.
You go back before there was Medicare, before
Sure.
there was Blue Cross Blue Shield. Seriously ill people in general were taken care of.
Mhm.
Hospitals, look.
Without being driven into
in
bankruptcy. Yeah.
Hold on for a
Yeah.
moment. In the 1930s or 20s,
Mhm.
when my wife and I were growing up, and we went to hospitals, we never were asked, do you have an insurance company? We never were asked.
Yeah.
We were taken, if in an emergency, you were taken into the hospital and treated. And then later they would come around and try to give you a bill and try to find out how it was going to be paid. But today, you go into a hospital, you can't get treatment until you've delivered them 3 insurance cards or some assurance
Sure.
of financial responsibility. So that social feeling of responsibility for somebody who's seriously ill has eroded. It's not gotten stronger. It was stronger before we had this system.
Yeah. Of course, the costs are, I mean, these things all interrelate to each other. They're dependent variables, but the costs are enormously higher now, as you've noted. And medical technology can do all these very costly, wonderful things, which
But
then...
many of those costs are higher not because of the improvements in medical technology, not because of the improvements in medical.
Sure.
After all, many of the improvements in medicine have made costs cheaper, not more expensive,
Yeah.
by providing means of prevention, by advanced
But
inoculation,
okay, but let's say...
by shortening the stays in hospitals.
But let's say, though, a bypass graft operation efficiently provided will consume the annual income of the average American.
Well, let's take a bypass.
People want
I beg your
that
pardon.
those who need it, you know...
Let's take a bypass
Yeah,
operation
right.
because I've had 2 of them. And I can speak with some personal authority.
You read the bill.
Yes,
Right.
and my first one
Yeah.
was nothing like so expensive as my second.
Mhm.
And my second was nothing like so expensive as I hear people now talking about.
Right.
And that's not because there have been any improvements whatsoever in the techniques or in the success rate. It's entirely because of an addition of administrative costs, of new regulations.
But
and
still,
new things.
the fact would remain, I think, that a bypass graft
my
efficiently
initial
provided...
bypass operation.
was,
No.
What do you
When
think?
I had it in 1972, if I recall, the costs were of the neighborhood of $3,000. That was not something which was beyond the reach,
Wow.
which exceeded the annual income.
You mean that's the hospital and the doctor
I
all
had it at
together
Mayo Clinics.
for $3,000?
Mayo Clinic. I think it was, you know, I won't guarantee it wasn't
Yeah, okay.
4,
Okay.
but it certainly wasn't 10.
Mhm.
That
Well,
was in
let's see.
1972.
Okay, and
that
what-
was
what do
20
we-
years ago.
And what do we have in the price level?
Oh,
4 or
from
5
72
fold?
down? No, not
No,
that much.
4-fold?
From 1972 to 92?
Yeah.
Probably at most a doubling or tripling.
Because...
Make that
yeah.
6,000 today.
No, I think it would be more, but...
It would be
But the
more.
Mayo Clinic is an efficient provider.
The second one I had is at Stanford Hospital, which is also supposed to be an efficient
No.
provider.
I wish it were, but I don't think anyone would claim that. You know.
Maybe.
No, they'd say because of the teaching responsibilities and a lot of other things that
Maybe. That
They're-
may well be.
striving to become so.
But nonetheless,
Um,
nonetheless, I don't believe that can explain.
I think that...
If you look at the figures on administrative costs alone, unfortunately, in the study I
Yeah.
made, I was hard put to it to get decent figures on administrative costs. You're much more of an expert in this area than I am, and I'm sure you could get them. And I would love to see a breakdown of total costs, medical costs, between administrative costs and actual medical costs. Well, I know that the fraction of total costs going to physicians has been going down, not up.
Well, physician gross incomes are about 20% of the grand total of healthcare costs. That's
Yeah.
been roughly steady, but of
They
course
were
the netting-
25% before World War II.
Oh, okay. I meant, you know, since 1960 or something. It's been fairly...
You're a young man, you see. You don't go
Right.
back as far.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's hard to sort out on this business of administrative costs. Part of it gets back to, one important source of administrative costs are dealing with individuals and small groups in health insurance markets. And that's why I'm looking for,
But
risk,
look, tell me what government-run program is
I
efficient.
didn't say government. I didn't
Tell
say
me what
I'm just saying-
government-run program...
I'm saying
No,
at
I'm saying
Stanford-
something different.
Okay.
What government-run program is efficient?
Well, I'll have to tell you when you're asking me that, recall, Milton, that I spent the 1960s as point man for Robert McNamara trying to bring cost effectiveness to the Defense
I
Department.
know that
And,
very well.
people, when I say that now, they kind of laugh, what a quixotic task. And I say the main thing that I learned then was that the ideal weapon system is built in 435 congressional districts, and it doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And so I certainly came away convinced there were systematic reasons why one cannot expect the Defense Department to be efficient. There are 435 congressmen who don't care whether the weapon works. They just want it built in their district with jobs protected and so
And it's
forth.
not very different in health care. And so, ultimately, I think we both agree,
Yeah.
I think, that the direction we ought to move in is greater individual responsibility.
Much greater, right.
We ought to move in the direction of more privatization, if I may call
Right.
it, of health care.
Yes.
And in particular, we ought to move in the direction of making it possible for individuals, rather than their employers.
Yeah. Right.
Now, I'm, I suppose, more radical and optimistic about how far you could conceivably go in that direction, and about how much good it would do than you are, because you've been more deeply involved in trying to do something.
You get worn down after a while. Well, it's that, and it's partly looking for efficient mechanisms for dealing with the administrative costs, achieving economies of scale, getting the information codified and communicated in such a way that people can understand it and act on it without, having to first become a PhD in medical economics.
Now, if to close our up, we move away from the question of what we would like to see happen, we might take just a minute for me to ask you a question. What do you think will in fact happen?
Well, first, we've got this monster, $820 billion of spending now, growing 11% per year. So I think that something serious is going to have to be done pretty soon, although whenever I say that, I think of my great professor Paul Samuelson, who was asked once, do you think there's going to be a recession next year? And he said, yes, I do, but of course you have to remember that I predicted 11 out of the last 5 recessions.
Yes,
So I think of that modestly, and I think I have predicted 20 out of the last 0 healthcare crises. But I think we'd agree that this has just gotten way too expensive.
It's
Something has to be done.
My
So-
feeling is that we're on a fast track toward complete socialized medicine.
So now I think we are at we're coming to a kind of a fork in the road. One point of view is we ought to make a serious effort to make market mechanisms work, and they include the kind of things you're talking
Right.
about: informed, responsible individual choice, that people have to understand this costs money. If they want something that costs more than something else, they have to pay for it, and so forth, versus the alternative, which has a strong contingent in Congress, wants to impose federal price controls on doctors and hospitals and drugs and everything else. And I think we would both be pretty horrified by that prospect.
But I think the second, the other track, or the second track, includes government assuming complete responsibility for payment of medical care,
Right,
what's called the Canadian or the British system,
yeah.
which are, as I see it in the American context, I think is operating badly there. And in Britain in particular, you're getting a growing contingent of private medicine side by side. And in Canada, they have the safety valve of coming to the United States.
Right.
It's interesting, British Columbia, you talked about bypass operations. They had such a long waiting list that they made a contract with a hospital in Seattle
Sure.
to do, I think, something like 200 bypasses at an average cost which was considerably less than their own average cost under
Sure.
the
Well, that was
socialized
smart.
system.
That was smart buying. Of course,
Very
that was a smart
buying.
move.
But what
Yeah.
I'm saying is,
Yeah.
if you move in that direction,
Mhm.
the ultimate result will be
Sure.
health rationing and long waiting
Yeah.
lists.
Well, the interesting thing is in Britain, of course, a couple of years ago, the conservative government made a major move in the direction of restructuring into something called the internal market,
Yeah.
and to restore market mechanisms, and to say that whereas previously each district health authority was the monopoly supplier for all services, now the district health authority becomes the purchaser on behalf of people in its district, but the services that they buy are supplied competitively. So they have, you know, done the thing that brought all the trouble, as you predicted. That is, by completely socializing it, they destroyed any incentive for people to use the services economically, or for people to improve the efficiency with which the services are provided. The efficiency got worse and worse and worse. The waiting times got longer and longer. And so they have moved back toward market mechanisms. And it's very interesting to watch. The first returns are quite promising, that when hospitals realize they're in competition, they start innovating in ways that bring down the cost.
Well, I hope we don't have to go through that costly process, that we can learn from their experience.
I sure hope so.
But I'm very pessimistic in this area.